Okay, well, many of you will know Fiorella. She's worked for SPUC for very many years. She's multi-talented. We talk about multitasking. Multi-talented. She's written very many novels. A Most Dangerous Innocence is the latest. I assume that's a novel, not an autobiography or something.
It's a novel.
Particularly pertinent to today is her wonderful book, The Abolition of Woman. So without further ado, I give you writer, bioethicist, Fiorella.
Hello. I hope you're all feeling wide awake after last night's Kaylee. It's been really wonderful to have the opportunity to get to meet so many of you this weekend and to hear about your pro-life work in the most hostile of forums. Before I say anything else, I want to say how very, very much I admire your commitment to life and the work you are doing, particularly in the university environment. I first got involved in pro-life campaigning as a student through the left-wing social justice sort of circuit. And really, I mostly got involved initially because I was so appalled by the way my pro-life friends were treated. Because I'd grown up with this really naive idea that we lived in a free country where you could express an opinion without harassment and certainly without being silenced. And it was a naive view of which I was robbed quite quickly by my student union, CUSU, whose motto, ironically, was minds wide open. I think the crowning moment was the evening I was escorted from the premises by two men, one the size of a rugby player, because somebody had disagreed with the pro-life stall. And you see, I am extremely physically intimidating, being 6'5" and built like a tank. So it did take two men to remove me from the building, and my other female colleague, who was likewise mountainous. And nothing says female empowerment like two privileged men pushing two girls out of a room. You know, I would just like to say you will never campaign in as hostile an environment as the sort of campaigning you are doing now. And it is so important, it's so necessary, and you need to know we're here for you. Any advice you need, materials you need, we're here for you. I'm not much of a salesman, but I've got a stall. Come and find me after the talk and buy my books, because I don't want to have to carry them home on the train. I nearly killed myself trying to get that suitcase up a flight of stairs at Euston Station. But Abolition of Women, really, it's the culmination of years of research and university talks and a lot of very intense debate and feedback, which I found very valuable. And it puts forward the case for re-examining the topic of abortion and related issues, IVF, surrogacy, sex-selective abortion, very much from the perspective of pro-life feminism. And as a writer with a focus on bioethics, I do put a lot of emphasis on the abortion debate, but I also cover a lot of other issues such as the contraceptive culture, the objectification of women in the media, trafficking, and many subjects, the coercive population control in China, that I think are very important to anyone, male or female. And most significantly, perhaps what's been most picked up in the media is the book is highly critical of radical feminism's unquestioning embrace of abortion and its stifling of debate within feminist circles. A major incentive to write the book was that in an increasingly intolerant and aggressive climate of no platforming and disruption of public meetings, it's getting harder and harder to challenge the status quo. And I felt that putting an argument in writing at least allows for a considered approach, you know, both in laying out an argument and also challenging an argument. Like many women of my generation, I liked to believe if I'd lived 100 years ago, I would have been a suffragette. I really fancied myself as marching for the right to vote, chaining myself to railings, addressing meetings maybe a little like these, and really making a big noise for women's representation in Parliament. I would probably have drawn the line at setting post boxes on fire and destroying priceless works of art. Everyone loves a rebel, but not usually when they're in the act of rebelling. In reality, the early feminists made up a very small minority of the population and were widely derided and opposed, even by other women. All movements start with a tiny but vocal minority, and almost always those movements face overwhelming opposition from the establishment and every possible attempt to silence them. So dear pro-life students, you follow in a very long tradition of rebels and feminists and dissidents who stand against the status quo and demand change. As a child of the 80s, I am that old, I don't even want to say what big milestone I'm going to reach later this year, there were certain things as a girl I simply took for granted. Britain had its first female Prime Minister in the person of Margaret Thatcher, and whatever you can say about her, and there's quite a lot people could probably say, submissive, subservient and a doormat were not usually things people said about the Iron Lady. Interestingly, I found out this earlier, the term Iron Lady, which was the epithet by which Margaret Thatcher was remembered even at the time of her death, it was first used as an insult. Before she was even Prime Minister back in the 70s, the Red Star, the official newspaper of the Soviet Army, gave her that name in an attempt at comparing her with Otto von Bismarck. The political reference was completely lost on the British public, and most people, but it's interesting to consider even in the 70s that giving a woman a title that implied great strength was regarded as hilarious, an insult that was intended to mock. It was perhaps the biggest PR disaster I think the Russians ever made. But all was not rosy for women. I also grew up in a minority group in a rural area of Britain where being a woman carried certain difficulties and restrictions with it. And I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves actually how very quickly, even within my lifetime, things have changed for women. Misogyny did not end with women getting the vote. And my own daughters already, I feel, have opportunities that I did not have or had to fight for a little more just a generation ago. When I got my GCSE results, this is one of those things that really sticks in my mind. My mother talks about how she was talking to another mother about GCSEs, and the other woman actually said the words, "But why would a girl even need them?" And that was in the late 90s. Why would she need GCSEs? You know, learnt enough by the time she's 14, isn't she? A meme that went around Facebook some time ago, I don't know how many people saw it, caused quite a lot of amusement. It showed a television interview from 1970 of a young female MP, very dynamic MP, called Janet Fuchs, who had just been elected to Parliament, being interviewed by veteran political commentator Sir Robin Day. And throughout the interview, this poor woman kept trying to talk about politics, about her policies. She was a teacher, and she was very interested in Tory educational policy. The problem was Robin Day wasn't interested. He kept asking her about her hobbies. Did she like reading, knitting, sailing? He just could not take seriously the fact she was a politician and kept talking down to her, rather like a grandfather might talk to an 8-year-old girl about her dollies. And Miss Fuchs's single status was mentioned on more than one occasion, and it was suggested she might be quite a catch for some courageous Westminster bachelor one day. And just in case the interview couldn't be enough of a car crash, right at the end, the presenter looked into the camera and said, "And for those of you who are watching in black and white, she's a very gorgeous redhead." A number of people responded saying, what are you making such a fuss about? Who cares that some old duffer patronised a woman on the television? But that interview signified a lot more than a condescending old man talking down to a woman on BBC television. It's hard to imagine today a female politician or any female professional being talked to like that on the television, or even a male presenter thinking of talking to a woman like that. So the world has changed. There has been some progress. Every female in this room, every single day of our lives, enjoy freedoms and opportunities that would have been denied us once. Every single time I put my card into an ATM and withdraw money, I exercise multiple freedoms. The right to withdraw money from an account I was permitted to set up in my name. and I use money earned through a job I'm permitted to do, largely in part because of the university degree I was allowed to study for. When I was at Cambridge, there were still women there who remembered the days when women were not allowed to obtain degrees. It was only in the mid-20th century that women were allowed formally to graduate from Cambridge. Every time I go to a polling station, which I seem to do with tedious regularity these days, I put a little cross in a box in a ballot paper. And by doing so, that is a testament to the many women who fought and sacrificed for the right to representation in Parliament, but also to the millions of men who fought and died to retain the right of all men and women to live in a democracy. But as far back as the 60s, and it was in the 60s, radical feminism made a choice which has resulted in the betrayal of women, an attack on the values and beliefs of millions of women around the world, and the silencing of the female voice within feminism, which it was supposed to liberate. Contrary to popular belief, it was only in the 60s that women's groups took on the idea of abortion as a right. We're so used to that as an idea, we forget, in fact, in political history, it is quite recent. And when that happened, it marked a disastrous break with the past. It meant the abandonment of a very basic principle of human rights campaigning, that the rights of one group may not be bought at the expense of another, that the liberation of women cannot be founded upon the blood of the innocent. From that moment onwards, radical feminism was no longer fighting against the patriarchy, no longer fighting for entrance into male-dominated institutions. Feminism was pitting itself against other women. Feminists were pitted against other feminists. You might say radical feminists pitted themselves against their own children, against their own fertile bodies. It's for this reason that I speak of the abolition of woman, because in fighting a just war to liberate women, we cannot support a system that subjugates others. If we blind ourselves to the inherent value of human life, we risk becoming so hardened, so inhumane, we may lose any sense of our humanity. We may abolish ourselves. Abortion involves the establishment of a brutal social hierarchy in which the most innocent and vulnerable lives can be sacrificed at will. Whenever I hear a feminist voice justifying abortion in the full knowledge of what abortion involves, we no longer live in a world where anyone really believes that abortion is the removal of a bundle of cells. What I'm hearing is the reinforcing of a patriarchal system in which the weakest are permitted to perish in the most brutal manner. And make no mistake, if you take nothing away from this conference and from this talk, please be in no doubt those who promote abortion know what they are doing. I'm prepared to accept in the 1960s, before the days of ultrasound, when very, very few people would have ever witnessed an abortion, most people never witnessed a birth, there might have genuinely been confusion, or at least a sense of ambiguity about what actually happens in an abortion procedure. If that was ever the case, it is no longer so. With more and more technological and medical advances, we're learning so much more about the humanity of the unborn child. It's simply impossible to avoid. That's why so many efforts are made to stop the subject being talked about at all. That's why abortion campaigners are so keen to stop pro-life people from talking, to silence debates, to use unjust and illiberal laws to prevent pro-life groups from keeping vigil outside clinics offering alternatives. That's why universities do everything possible to stop student groups from being set up and from functioning. Your only attempt to suppress the truth if you know that it is the truth and that it's going to hurt you. In her book, A Moral Case for Abortion, Anne Furedi attempts to take on the issue of abortion and killing, and the results are alternately bewildering and terrifying. Science does not offer a great consolation to those who wish to deny the humanity of the unborn child. And Furedi is forced to acknowledge repeatedly, yes, abortion involves killing, in the sense that it stops a beating heart, but not in the sense it stops a person from living. She then goes on at great length about the Zoe and the bios, and it's wrong on so many levels, it's difficult to know where to start. But I mean, you know, you can trip yourself up so many times trying to say, well, it's real, it's alive, but it's not alive, it's alive, yes, it's alive. Normally, I always beg people to avoid making comparisons with the Holocaust and other genocides when talking about abortion, because though there are some terrible comparisons to be made, particularly with the eugenics movement of the 30s, which preceded the final solution, I don't feel it's helpful or sensitive, as a general rule, to use other people's tragedies to try to make sense of our own. But this does not stop Anne Furedi from using the Holocaust to justify abortion. The most heartless argument I think I came across when sifting through this tome was the statement, the qualities that the embryo lacks are precisely those that make the terror of extermination so dreadful for individual people. The capacity for self-consciousness, the capacity for rational thought, the capacity to imagine a future for oneself, the capacity to remember a past involving oneself, and the capacity for being a subject of non-momentary interests. Is that so? How does that actually make any sense? Now, take a scenario, it's not a very nice one. God forbid, a gunman burst into my house with a machine gun blazing. The chances are I would have time to die frightened and distraught, knowing I was about to be killed terribly. I would experience that horror of extermination. My little one, who is not yet at the age of reason, would have no idea that she was about to be killed. In what way would her killing be more morally acceptable than mine? How would her lack of awareness make her murder less of a tragedy, less of an outrage? Millions of young children and infants who have been killed as part of genocidal atrocities over the centuries, who are still being killed in some parts of the world, can have little or no capacity to remember a past involving oneself. But no one with an ounce of humanity would suggest the youngest human lives lost to violence don't matter for that reason. If anything, we feel an even greater sense of outrage, a greater sense of horror at the thought of little ones being slaughtered along with their parents. But her belief, echoed by so many abortion campaigners around the world, that abortion ends a human life, but a human life that does not really matter, is the most dangerous and detrimental idea to have emerged from the abortion movement. Essentially, the point for us is not when human life begins, but when life begins to matter. It's not my place to decide when human life begins to matter enough to be granted the privilege of being protected. It was never the business of the feminist movement to determine which lives should be granted protection and which should be violently ended. This is not the language of social justice. But the widespread acceptance of abortion has desensitized society to the notion that human life is expendable simply for being inconvenient. This attitude does not just affect abortion law. You quite often hear people say, oh, abortion is a single issue. I don't want to get involved in a single issue. But this is not a single issue. It reverberates throughout human rights debates and permeates our understanding of what it means to be human at any level. During a recent online debate of a rather bad-natured nature about abortion, they usually are, a relative of mine openly stated that the right to life may not be absolute. You know, we have to accept that. It may not be absolute. There are no absolutes. We have to challenge everything. Absolutely. And my parting shot was, thank you for your honesty. Could we please now tear up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and start again? It ought to give abortion advocates pause for thought that having lost the argument that the unborn child is just a bundle of cells, they're now coming perilously close in some quarters to denying the importance of the right to life at any point. Perhaps we've simply come too far from the dark days in which the Nuremberg trials and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were first formulated, to appreciate what happens when the right to life is regarded as a fundamentalist position. Maybe we're just too comfortable, too cosseted, too pleased with ourselves to appreciate the consequences of such rhetoric. Mercifully few, if any, people in this room will have lived in a country at war, will have watched the rapid breakdown in law and order that goes on, or lived in a state where journalists can be murdered in broad daylight for investigating corruption. Sorry. So certain people in this room know exactly what I mean. But when human lives stop mattering, it's only a matter of time before others become expendable. I don't know how many of you watched recently the episode of Call the Midwife. You know exactly which one I mean, where a woman dies of an illegal abortion, and then there's a great big thing about, when are you going to change the law? Hint. Now, this was not so much a revealing glimpse of life before abortion was legalised as a propaganda exercise intended to rally support for abortion. But no one denies that backstreet abortions ever happened. The lie put out by abortion campaigners is in terms of the numbers, which were hugely, hugely inflated. Bernard Nathanson, who was a big abortion campaigner in the States and performed tens of thousands of abortions himself before he converted, changed his mind. He then started fighting. He spent the rest of his life fighting the monster he'd in part helped to create. He admitted candidly that when they were trying to change the law on abortion in the States, they simply made up the figures. Huge figures, thousands and thousands of women bleeding to death in the back streets. They had no idea how many were dying, only that it was actually quite a small number. They knew those figures were false, but they knew the media would swallow the lie because it was predisposed to swallow the lie. But certainly, some backstreet abortions happened, and do happen, even if on a much smaller scale than is often claimed. During a media appearance, I found myself being interviewed immediately after a harrowing description of a woman undergoing a backstreet abortion in the early 60s. The tactic was quite deliberate. I was told I was talking about something completely different. This is the way the BBC works. Love the BBC. Very, very impartial that they are. I don't have a hang-up about this at all. But the tactic was completely deliberate. It was meant to force me to back down or sound really heartless. But I made the point, which I still make. All abortion is a tragedy wherever it happens. It is a tragedy. No one denies that women sometimes become pregnant without intending to or wanting to. No one denies that pregnancy can be incredibly distressing and difficult at times for some women. But pro-life feminism separates itself from the death-dealing feminism rooted in the 60s, in that we seek compassionate solutions that protect both the mother and the baby. Pro-life equals all human life. It means the mother, it means the baby, it means a person with a disability, it means an elderly person, it means the homeless man facing freezing to death on the streets, it means infants in developing countries who are dying for want of basic vaccines. It means women in sub-Saharan Africa whose lives could be saved in childbirth by obstetric interventions we take for granted in Britain. What saddens me the most when I hear stories of women in the 50s and 60s seeking a legal abortion was the complete lack of any support that they had to carry a baby to term and to raise a child. How easily a woman, particularly a young woman, could find herself completely isolated, abandoned by family, sacked from a job in the absence of good employment law, stigmatised, penniless and alone. Contrary to popular belief, it was not just in Ireland in the past that young girls pregnant out of wedlock had their babies forcibly taken from them. Right up until the 1970s in this country, there were hostels where girls could be sent during pregnancy, where it was simply expected that they would give up the baby when they gave birth, and it would be handed over to a respectable couple who would bring it up properly. I remember hearing a very, very distressing story in one of these documentaries about uniting families of a woman whose daughter is now in her 40s, she was born in the early 70s, who spoke about the day she had to give up her baby, how it took her 2 hours to get that baby ready because she couldn't bear the idea she would never see that baby again. And all those many years later, she stood before the camera weeping, trying to say, if she ever met her daughter, she wanted her to know she never wanted to be parted from her. And is there anyone in this room who approves of that? Is there anyone in this room who wants to see a world where women are alone? Where women are mistreated like that? There's an underlying assumption that those who oppose abortion don't care about women, including women who oppose abortion. And in case you were in any doubt, the majority of women, in surveys, far more women than men oppose abortion, which makes perfect sense if you think about it. I've given talks where feminists have turned up simply to denounce me. I won't even use the language that tends to get used, oh, for the days of a classy insult, or who try to sort of bully or emotionally blackmail me into seeing the error of my ways. Because feminists love listening to other women as long as we keep to the script. But when I point out that by pro-life, I mean the woman's life matters as much as the baby's life, jaws start to hit the floor. And nobody apparently has thought about this. Yet so much pro-abortion rhetoric presupposes that pro-life campaigners want women to die, or have never actually heard that any woman has ever suffered during a pregnancy. Because we're not always inherently evil, sometimes we're just a little naive. Because, of course, pro-life women never get pregnant, and pro-life women never get raped, never get unexpectedly pregnant, never get ill, never find themselves in abusive relationships. Life's so perfect for us that we don't understand how distressing pregnancy is for real women living in the real world that we don't inhabit. This isn't entirely a rant, by the way. I do have some points to make later on. Getting a few things off my chest. A collection of essays that was published before the Irish referendum, considering both sides of the debate, was very much a case in point. I feel in a way that they really reflected a lot of the tone of the referendum, unfortunately. The pro-abortion essays were replete with heart-rending stories told to defend abortion on the assumption that we all need persuading that women's lives matter. A girl dying, giving birth alone to hide her shame. A woman dying an agonising death of cancer because she was refused treatment during pregnancy because the doctors were ignorant about the principle of double effect. The fact that no one wants to live in a world where these horrors happen is never considered, or that we could, heaven forfend, work together, unite to promote humane alternatives to women suffering and babies dying through abortion. This is a bit of a digression, but the outraged rhetoric got so out of hand during the Irish referendum that in this book, one author angrily wrote about a deeply distressed and indignant woman who, thanks to living in pro-life Ireland, discovered she was pregnant alone in a toilet. I don't know if anyone here is ignorant about the way pregnancy tests work, but it generally involves piddling on a stick. So unless Irish women generally urinate in public, every woman who has ever discovered she's pregnant did so alone in a toilet. And this may seem a bit of a digression, it may seem sort of like a small point to make, but it's an absurd detail, but this is actually a very serious subject. And I've spent so much of my life wading through this nonsense that it really makes me wish we could spend more time working on solutions and less time on the faux outrage. No pregnant woman should be mistreated. No pregnant woman should have to face that journey alone. But abortion compounds one injustice with the most grievous injustice of them all. It's quite right that pro-life campaigners also fight for better working conditions for pregnant women, for maternity pay, that pro-life groups offer pastoral and emotional support to women who find themselves pregnant and alone. To be there for a woman in a crisis pregnancy is surely the most empowering and life-affirming response. The acceptance of abortion compounds many injustices facing women and continues to do so. I wonder how the early feminists would feel if they could see the way abortion is used as a weapon against women, just as they themselves predicted it would. Those brave mothers of the feminist movement who fought to get women the vote, who fought for access to higher education, how would they feel? How would Elizabeth Cady Stanton respond, having described the violence of abortion as degrading to women, if she knew that thousands and thousands of women in China have been forcibly aborted in the name of population control, whilst the liberal Western elite looked on and praised China's achievements in this field? The betrayal of women in China by the West must never be forgotten. It sickens me to consider the way the citizens of that country the citizens of this country rather, have justified the Chinese state's determination to take personal control of every single woman's fertility. Church and state should not dictate, except one particular state that can do just that while we turn our backs. How would those brave early feminists feel if they could look upon a world in which millions of baby girls have been killed before birth simply for being girls? Would it comfort them to know that a baby girl is aborted every minute in India, and that more girls are killed through gendercide than all the men were killed in all the wars of the 20th century combined? Western feminists justify this horror because they're too cowardly to call out sex-selective abortion for what it is: violent misogyny in its most extreme form. There is no greater violence against women than to kill them in utero simply for the crime of being female. And if you think it doesn't happen in this country, it does. A study by the Independent newspaper some years ago found that 1 in 10 baby girls were missing in some communities in this country. How would those trailblazers of women's rights feel if they knew that the very same feminists who weep crocodile tears over tales of backstreet abortions in the past have deliberately covered up the deaths of women and babies in legal abortion clinics in the West? Dr. Kermit Gosnell, whom some of you will have heard of, is believed to have been the most prolific mass murderer in American criminal history. But it's telling that this monster has been so well protected that the majority of people have never heard of him. And a recent film about his crimes had to be crowdfunded, and every possible obstacle was placed to stop it from being distributed. Gosnell, his wife, and a number of associates are now in jail for running what has been dubbed a house of horrors. For 17 years, Gosnell ran a filthy and dangerous abortion facility in which unqualified staff were employed, life-saving equipment was permanently broken, women were lied to about how far along their pregnancies were so that they would undergo illegal late-term abortions. And the babies who survived the procedure, of which there were hundreds, were stabbed to death through the back of the neck with a pair of scissors by a laughing doctor. Women were maimed and killed. And all of this occurred under the noses of the state health authorities and the National Abortion Federation, which claims to exist to protect women. Ironically, Gosnell was only busted in the end because the police were investigating a drugs operation. They didn't know what he was doing. And when they got to the clinic, they stumbled upon bags and bags of baby remains. I can guarantee to you that if Gosnell's clinic had existed in a country where abortion is illegal, the whole world would know every gory detail, because it would be politically expedient to broadcast the horrors of backstreet abortion. But Gosnell peddled abortion in a country with some of the most liberal abortion laws in the world, so his crimes were covered up. We owe it to the memory of the early feminists as much as to future generations of women to call out abortion for the violent practice it is, to call to account groups who refuse to give women a voice within the movement, for daring to dissent on abortion. We owe it to future generations of doctors, nurses and midwives to demand that abortion campaigners keep their hands off the right to conscientious objection. We cannot talk about freedom, we certainly can't talk about freedom of choice, if we deny the rights of medical professionals to conscientious objection to abortion. It disgusted me how little support there was for two midwives in Glasgow, Mary Dugan and Connie Woods, who found themselves facing the might of the establishment simply because they were being forced to supervise abortion and they said no. If feminist groups really believed in the rights of women to pursue their professional careers without harassment, they would have rallied to the side of those two softly spoken, highly experienced, completely committed midwives, whose only crime was to refuse to kill their own patients. But what almost disturbs me the most about the increasingly aggressive rhetoric used within feminist circles to support abortion is just how heartless it is, but also how brainless. I think contrary to popular belief, compassion and intellectual honesty go together. The lack of one almost inevitably leads to the loss of the other. Raising a child with a disabling condition has really opened my eyes to just how vicious the rhetoric of abortion has become and how dehumanising. It's not so long ago that an abortion apologist on an online journal supported the right to abort a disabled baby on the grounds that a woman should not be expected to raise a child she may dread and wish dead. Even at the time of reading it, when I was still a student, I was overwhelmed by how judgmental and ugly that argument was. That tendency to cast a child with a disability as some kind of Frankenstein monster from which a woman needs to be freed. Now that I am the mother of a child with a disabling condition, it makes my blood run cold to consider the impact such statements have not only on the rights of the disabled child to be born, but on the kind of life they can be permitted to live, assuming they actually make it to birth. Even when statements are less blatant than that, that false compassion does little to hide the wicked way in which families with disabled loved ones are characterised. In her book, A Moral Case for Abortion, which is a question incidentally she never answers, Furedi airily speaks of how a diagnosis of Down syndrome may compel one woman to end her pregnancy, whilst another decides to embrace the child as special. Firstly, the word special is short for special needs, special educational needs. It's not a sentimental epithet. And this is something we just have to be a little bit careful about, because I've heard people well-intentionally say, "Oh, she calls him her special son. Isn't that sweet?" Well, if that's the way she wants to see it, forget it, that's just ignorance. I can't speak for women with Down syndrome children, but I can say, I don't embrace my child as special. I embrace him as a human being and as my son. I embrace him as a unique individual with the right to life. Women do not generally love and accept their disabled children because they think they're little angels gift-wrapped by Jesus to enlighten them. My son is my son, who happens to have a disabling condition. He's no more or less special than his other siblings, and it does not take more effort to love him or accept him than the others. If anything, I would say the opposite is true. When you have a child who is uniquely vulnerable, you tend to feel more affectionate towards them, more protective. The bond between you gets so very close. Is raising a special needs child a challenge? Yes. It's an extraordinary challenge for which women need a great deal of support. We should not forget that the love involved is not just between mother and child, it is also between children and their brothers and sisters. And one of the saddest arguments I hear for abortion and disability is that it will affect negatively the other children in a family. And it just doesn't have to be that way. You know, some time ago, a mother actually told me that my daughter was in reception class last year, and her son has special needs, and he'd got very upset, and she'd gone up behind him and started rubbing his back to calm him down, because she'd seen me do that when my son's having a meltdown. And she said she'd never seen a 5-year-old actually know how to handle a child having a meltdown like that, but she just instinctively knew what to do and felt drawn to him, and it established a bond between those children. So actually, you know, love, it extends right across a family. And I sort of feel, without, you know, wishing to sound kind of middle-aged and sort of sentimental, that love seems to be the one thing that pro-abortion campaigners simply can't get their autonomous heads around. And, you know, we have to make sure we don't fall into that trap, you know. When I first started working for SPUC, I had the biggest disaster of my working career. I was sent to Newcastle to give a talk about cloning, about which I knew nothing. And somebody had written the talk for me, and I stumbled my way through somatic cell transfer. I was in a complete blind panic. And normally at the end of a talk, the chairman will come up and say something positive, like, "Oh, thank you so much for that interesting talk," or whatever. And this was such a disaster that the chairman stood there and went, "What a nice name you've got." I was just thinking, what a pretty name. And that was actually the only positive thing he could think of saying. But the one valuable lesson from that particularly disastrous conference, besides a lesson in humility, I still wake up in the night thinking about that, was an elderly man stood up during the Q&A, beautifully dressed, very, very suave, and said, "Shouldn't we remember that when we make love, we are participating in an act of creation?" And you know, I almost cried, because I just thought, love, gosh, make love. My generation just talk about having sex. You know, if you're lucky, someone might talk about responsibility. We certainly talk a lot about rights. Love? Oh yeah, that's what it's all about. The act of creating life, and therefore the act of welcoming and nurturing life. It's supposed to be rooted in love. Love and compassion, real compassion, not the cop-out, fake compassion that just ignores abortion or colludes with it. Real, self-sacrificing, life-affirming love and compassion, combined with intellectual honesty, makes for a formidable force against the culture of death. And they do belong together. The idea that any major social justice battle will be won by argument alone is naive, and in many ways it misses the point. I speak often about that need to walk that hard and lonely road of pro-life feminism, because I believe that all movements that have always changed the world, changed them irrevocably, changed the way society thinks, the way it behaves, begins with the courage of a tiny minority, even a minority of one who just take that first step on a road, say no, and move on, and change the way people think. But one of the most ignorant insults ever levelled against womankind is that we're too emotional. Men are so very reasonable, women get all emotional about everything. But let's try turning that insult on its head for a minute. Women are not more emotional than men. They have higher levels of emotional intelligence, a greater ability to empathise with others. Emotional intelligence is a great strength. It is not a burden. But it's typical that a gift that women bring to the world should for centuries have been used by misogynists against us as proof that we're by nature irrational, sentimental, even hysterical. Let's reclaim that strength. Let's reclaim that gift to the world and to the movement. Because the battle to protect and respect human life at its most vulnerable is the great social justice campaign of our day. There is no better movement to fight it than pro-life feminism, a movement which embraces and celebrates the dignity of women, the sanctity of life, and the need for men and women to work together with complementary gifts, yet as equals in pursuit of the common good. And if you are well informed, you will speak convincingly. But if you have love and compassion, you will be heard. Thank you. Sorry? Okay, sure.